Very good evening, everybody. Can I just ask everyone to turn their cameras and their sounds off so that we can take full advantage of the lecture? So I'm delighted to welcome this evening renowned local historian and published author, Nick Baxter, who is going to be talking to us this evening about Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge in Wiltshire. Now, we're delighted that Nick has agreed to join us tonight. He is a new summer school tutor, and there are a couple of places left for each week that he's teaching his new course, Discovering Marlborough History. So due to technical issues, we're going to have to socially distance shuffle seats. So without further ado, I shall welcome Nick Baxter.
Oh, good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this evening. It's a great privilege to be here. So with no more ado, I shall start the show. Thank you. Coleridge in Wiltshire, perhaps not so well known. Everybody knows about his time in the Lake District, time in Bristol, time in Nether Stowey in Somerset. In fact, he lived in Wiltshire from September 1814 to March 1816. He lived for a couple of months in Ashley, the small hamlet near Box, the western end of the county, and for 16 months in the lively market town of Calne, just up the road from here. If you go to Calne today, you may find it quite difficult to see much of what was there when Coleridge was living in Calne 200 years ago. The Harris pork processing factories, which came later, were demolished in the 80s, leaving quite a hole in the town centre. The 1968 Relief Road damaged, destroyed many of Calne's historic properties. But my interest in all this came about when I discovered that he performed his play Remorse in Calne in August 1815. And I found this out because I happened to be at Coleridge Cottage in Nether Stowey, which is run by the National Trust and acts like a kind of museum. And on the first floor there is a poster encased in glass advertising the play. It's a handbill of the time printed by Mr. Bailey of Calne. I was interested in it to the point that I wanted to take a photograph, and difficult with the glass, with light going everywhere. But the National Trust were very good. Their photographer, Dave Wood, took a photograph for me and sent it to me. So there you are. That's the only artifact from Calne that you can see in Coleridge Cottage. And as you can see, it's two technical issues here.
Okay.
Am I good?
Yeah. Can everybody see that? Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
Okay. So I've tried to break that up really to give you some kind of idea that this is the last night of performing Remorse in Calne. His tragedy of Remorse having been received by unbounded applause. And we know from this that it had been performed in London for 30 successive nights. And the cast, the 9 members of the cast, plus extras that were playing familiars of the Inquisition, we can get an idea. The company was an itinerant stage playing company led by Mr. Faulkner, provincial stage players. They were performing this play in Calne, making Coleridge a provincial celebrity. And the timing is quite interesting. This is within weeks of the Battle of Waterloo. So closely followed as part of the programme is the song Waterloo or Wellington Forever, and concluded by the laughable farce Honest Thieves. Coleridge was living with his friends John and Mary Morgan and Mary's sister Charlotte Brent in a Georgian terrace house in Church Street, Calne in Wiltshire. And the plaque that you can see today tells us that he wrote his Biographia Literaria in Calne, his literary life and opinions. So how did Coleridge end up in Wiltshire? In particular, how did he end up? How did he come to be in Calne? It's a fascinating story in its own right. The story began on the night of Saturday, the 23rd of January, 1813, some 2.5 years earlier, with the premiere of Remorse at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, London. I don't know whether there's a curtain, John. I don't know if there is or not. I'll just manage. The play was based on Coleridge's earlier play Osorio, employing dramatic Gothic moments. At the end of the play, the villain, Don Alva, is killed on stage amidst dramatic clashes of music. A real tour de force, a real popular performance. Set in 16th century Granada during the Spanish Inquisition, the play was a resounding success, and as we know, went on for 30 successive nights. But Coleridge, albeit a literary genius, 40 years old, had a few problems. He'd been estranged from his family, from his wife and children, and stricken with an addiction to laudanum, a common opium and brandy mixture of the time, the common painkiller of the time. Coleridge had become dependent on it. He was living in London when Remorse was being shown with his friend, John Morgan, John's wife Mary, and Mary's sister Charlotte Brent. And financial success, he made somewhere in the region of £400 from those 30 nights, which may not sound much today, but it's equivalent to about £30,000. And of course, he had the rights, the copyright for the play as well, so that it was good for him. He had the money, so they moved into quite a nice house just off of Oxford Street in Berners Street. But then Morgan's business collapsed, leaving him heavily in debt. This is the time of the Napoleonic Wars. It wasn't easy running a business at this time. They had to sell the house, or they had to let the house. They didn't have to sell it. They let the house and sold the furniture and moved into lodgings. Creditors were on his back. And of course, in those days, you could be thrown into prison for debt. So poor John Morgan fled to Ireland, leaving Coleridge and his wife and Morgan's wife and Morgan's sister behind in lodgings. Coleridge didn't allow this to happen without a fight. He travelled to Bristol, where he knew many people like Joseph Cottle, the publisher, Josiah Wade, the merchant, and he pulled strings and got people together to try to raise money to help his friend John Morgan. He managed Morgan's debts and loans, and he took up a course of lecturing and raised almost £300, settling most of Morgan's debt. But he was very concerned that his dear loves, as he called them, Mary Morgan and Charlotte Brent, had been left on their own in these rather nasty lodgings, and he wanted to rescue them, to bring them to the West Country, close to where he was working in Bristol, to pursue a rural life. So on Monday the 29th of November, after he'd finished his lectures in Bristol, he went up to London, rescued them, and left in a hired post-chaise. No doubt they would have passed Salt Hill, with its views of Windsor Castle, now subsumed by Slough, and on to Maidenhead, and on through to Reading, where they stayed the night, and on the Tuesday morning, 30th of November, set off again through Newbury, Hungerford, down Forest Hill into Marlborough, as you can see there. Marlborough, incidentally, was a busy town where many coaches changed their horses. 44 coaches a day changed their horses here at the time Coleridge came through. They carried on onto Beckhampton and onto the improved Bath Road, what we now call the A4, through Cheryl, Calne and Chippenham, and onto Bath that way, avoiding the old route above the high ground down through Laycock and onto Bath, or the alternative Devizes, Seend and Melksham route. There you can see, they stayed the night in Chippenham, the second night in Chippenham. These buildings you can see at the beginning of Antiques Roadshow. Some of you may recognise them. And then they carried on. Coleridge had hired a cottage, a small cottage in the Wiltshire hamlet of Ashley, half a mile from Box, 5 miles from Bath. And it was owned by Mrs. Smith, a Box grocer, who was not too fussy about who stayed in her cottage. It must have seemed a bit odd that here we have this man moving in with his friend's wife and friend's wife's sister, but she wasn't worried about that. Ashley was just a cluster of stone cottages with a farm and a manor house. The manor house is there today, which you can still see. Today, of course, it's now bypassed. In fact, the A4 was bypassed soon after the railway was built in 1841 to follow a more gentle route down into Barthampton. There you can see where Ashley is today. In 1885, you can see the bypass is already in place. The milestone is still there. And the view across from the high ground across the box, this would have been very similar to the view that Coleridge would have had. We don't know where his cottage was, it's long gone, but we do know from his notes and letters that he could see, he had views of Box, and he frequently walked over the fields to Box. Ominously, the Box madhouse is situated just a few hundred yards from where Coleridge lived. Well connected, two stagecoaches pass through, the mail coach passed through twice daily. So well connected to London, Bath and Bristol. 5 miles to Bath, 18 miles to Bristol. Coleridge had work in Bristol. He had more lectures to give. Bristol was the place to be for him. Expanding city, this was to become Clifton. So he was to start his new lectures on Tuesday the 7th of December and visit his dear loves Mary and Charlotte every weekend, to travel the 18 miles back to Ashley to stay with his dear loves every weekend. That was the plan, but it was not to be. We don't know what happened. We do know that all three of them had come down with colds during the journey from London, so they weren't very well. Whether there'd been some kind of an argument, whether he'd had some particularly nasty overdose of too much laudanum, maybe too much to drink, we don't really know what happened. But he abandoned Mary and Charlotte. He walked out clutching a bag of books. He'd missed the last stagecoach. It was raining, so he walked down into Bath 5 miles through mud or mire the whole way and collapsed in the first coaching inn that he came to, the Greyhound, where he spent almost the next 2 weeks in an attic bedroom. He'd had a major nervous breakdown. He was hallucinating, sweating, muscular pains. He couldn't even talk coherently. Mrs. May, the landlady, thought this gentleman was going to die. So she called in a doctor because Coleridge was too wild with suffering to do anything for himself. And luckily for Coleridge, it was Caleb Parry who came in, who was summoned. This man was one of the foremost Bath physicians of the time. You may be aware that Bath was at the forefront of medical research at this time. It's where people went to take the waters. So it's a good place if you have to have a breakdown to have one there. In fact, Parry's son had accompanied Coleridge in a trip to Germany back in the 1790s when they were young men. And he took charge of Coleridge with parental kindness. He was almost a nurse rather than a doctor. He called in several times a day to the Greyhound, talking through with him his hallucinations, noting how depressed in spirit he was, keeping him from his thoughts. And Coleridge later admitted that if Parry had not been the doctor who looked after him, he would have died. There's his house, it's still there in the circus in Bath. But he was not there for long. Just before Christmas, a carriage appeared. Coleridge was bundled into it and sent off to the home of Josiah Wade, his merchant friend in Queen Square, Bristol, and ensconced in a drawing room there. Under the care of Henry Daniel, Wade's personal physician, and Mr. Haberfield slept in the drawing room in a truckle bed to make sure that Coleridge didn't get up to anything. Coleridge himself was absolutely distraught when he discovered what had happened. He realised what had happened and openly admitted that he would prefer to be in a private madhouse where he would be constantly looked after. And he felt he'd insulted God by the way that he'd behaved, that he behaved in this terrible way. Oh God, save me from myself. The worst offences are those against our own souls. He wrote to Mary Morgan and Charlotte Brent, begging forgiveness and expressing devastation and regret as to what had happened, apologising profusely. And amazingly, Charlotte wrote back. There was some thought perhaps he could come back to Ashley, but clearly he wasn't well enough yet. Even when John Morgan returned to England from Ireland in May 1814, and joined his wife and wife's sister at the cottage in Ashley, it was still considered too risky for Coleridge to join them yet. Even though his opium, his laudanum, was going down, he was reducing it, but he admitted that at his worst he had been taking a pint of laudanum a day, which was potentially a fatal dose. Most doctors would accept that that would have killed you, and great quantities of liquor. You're lucky to be alive, quite frankly. But his distraught, he was so distraught that he accepted that he'd been cruel to Mary and Charlotte, and how he regretted that, and how he deceived, tricked and lied about his drug addiction. He began to make signs of recovery. He started having friends round, held levees in his bedroom, and began by the end of June to make short weekend visits to the Morgans in Ashley, all the time trying to reduce this laudanum. He even, at one of the letters he wrote to John Morgan, he started flirting. My best love to Mary and Charlotte. In Bristol they will have it that Mary is handsomer than Charlotte. How provokingly obstinate. He clearly had some kind of thing about Charlotte Brent. There's little doubt about that. Meanwhile, across the Channel, things were coming to a head. A great Allied army had surrounded Paris. Napoleon was trapped like a rat in a trap. He had no choice but to abdicate at Fontainebleau in Paris. The old order was restored. The Bourbon dynasty was brought back. Louis was returned as king, and Napoleon was sent to the island of Elba. Throughout the summer, Bristol was celebrating. Flambeaux were burning on the crenellations of St Mary Redcliffe Church. Bonfires were lit on Brandon Hill in the distance. A triumphal arch was erected in Calne Street. Napoleon is depicted there, crying his eyes out. And you can see why. Coleridge himself designed a transparency featuring Napoleon as a vulture chained to a rock, his wings clipped by Britannia with shears inscribed with the names of Nelson and Wellington. Sadly, that transparency has been lost, but we do know the words. We fought for peace and conquered it at last. The raven in vulture's leg is fettered fast. Britons rejoice, and yet be wary too. The chain may break, the clipped wings sprout anew. Coleridge's friend, Washington Alston, was exhibiting his artworks at an exhibition in the Merchant Taylor's Hall. And Coleridge helped his friend by writing a series of articles to Felix Farley's Bristol Journal on the nature and beauty of art. He extolled his friend's work. And so grateful was Alston that he produced a 3/4 length portrait of Coleridge, posed in the solemnity of the Merchant Taylor's Hall, which you can see there. In particular, look at the face, look at the eyes, look at the hair. This does not look like a man of 41 years old, does it really? After what he'd been through, it's hardly surprising. But Coleridge is determined to return to Ashley, absolutely determined to do so. He even sends a box of books and clothes by the canal to Bath and on by cart to Ashley. But he's not well. Not only is he's still struggling with his mental health, albeit slowly getting better, he has erysipelas inflammation of the legs, stricture of the urethra, cirrhosis of the liver, kidney stone, gout, angry itching. No wonder he felt Beelzebubbed. He could not hold down any course of lectures anymore. His lectures have been postponed from December and postponed again and postponed again. He simply didn't have the concentration to do that. He could write articles, but he could do little else. So without commissioned work, he didn't have a great deal of money, but nevertheless, he returned to Ashley in the second week of September to be with his dear loves, sharing the tenancy with John Morgan. And his notebooks are interesting because he clearly has this love of nature, and the clearness of the sky and the freshness of the autumn rains come across as he stood by his cottage window listening to the sounds of a steady soaking rain. And when the sky cleared, walking out and standing beneath a full uncurtainment of sprinkled stars, a milky stream and dark blue interspaces. So deep was the silence of the night that the drips from the leaves of the garden trees copied a steady shower. And he has order and routine in his life. Breakfast before 9, work till 1, walk and read till 3, chat or read some lounge book, from 6 to 8, work again, 8 to bedtime, play whist, then sup and go to bed. There's a structure to his life once more. The laudanum is coming down. He even held off his afternoon dose if he wasn't in too much pain. He held it off till 6:30. So he was trying. And his writings are quite phenomenal. The bag of books that he had contained philosophical works by German philosophers like Schelling, Fichte, Klopstock. The new dynamic German philosophy that he was so interested in is writing up at length. This he saw as his most important work, almost an obsession with this kind of philosophy. So he went out he walked out. Corsham was just a few miles up the road. That he could take the stagecoach to Chippenham, 7 miles away to Chippenham, and on to Studley, where he could walk the mile up to this small village of Bremill, just 2 miles from Calne, where he met and spent a day with his friend, the poet parson William Lyle Bowles. And people don't realise, but Bowles influenced not just Coleridge, but also William Wordsworth and Robert Southey. He was the father of the Romantic movement in so many ways, little appreciated today. At the age of 17, as a schoolboy at Christ's Hospital in London, Coleridge first read Bowles's poems and was so struck by their connections with nature that he wrote this as a thank you. My heart has thanked thee, Bowles, for those soft strains, whose sadness soothes me like the murmuring of wild bees in the sunny showers of spring. He thought Bowles's parsonage was a sweet place. And there's the church where Bowles was the parson. A lovely place, St Martin's Church, Bremill. He was invited by Paul Methuen, County Member of Parliament for Wiltshire, to view his paintings at Corsham House. As I said, Corsham was just a few miles up the road from Ashley. It's very easy to go there. You can go there today. It's now called Corsham Court. The paintings, many of them are the ones that Coleridge himself would have seen. Methuen introduced him to Lord Lansdowne, who invited him over to dine with him at Bowood House near Calne. And Coleridge must have been chuffed when one of the servants came up to him and said, "Are you the Mr. Coleridge, the great author?" You know, people still knew that he was a great literary man, and I think he must have been chuffed by that. However, obviously Henry Daniel couldn't carry on treating him now that he moved away from Queen Square in Bristol. Coleridge is now in Ashley, so he needed a new doctor. Daniel referred him to Dr. Brabant from Devizes. And Coleridge went over to Devizes and met Dr. Brabant and got on very, very well with Brabant's family. You might notice there that there were windmills in Devizes at this time. They didn't grind corn, they ground tobacco, because Devizes was a place where they made snuff. You need to pulverise tobacco for that. And it was Dr. Brabant who recommended Coleridge and Morgan to Dr. George Page, a Calne surgeon who owned these two houses next to each other in Church Street. There's no guess which one Coleridge ended up living in, of course, because of the plaque on the wall. Page lived in the larger of the house. They had more land at the back. It had stables at the back, whereas Coleridge's house, as it was to be, the one that was up for rental, had just a courtyard. But nevertheless, Calne seemed to be the obvious place to live. Bremill's just up the road. Bowood's just literally not that far away, a mile or two, just outside of Calne. It wasn't difficult to get over to Devizes to see his doctor. He had a bit more life going to it than Ashley. He didn't need to be in Bristol any longer. He wasn't lecturing anymore. So living in Calne seemed the obvious thing to do. And John Morgan agreed. So they moved in, probably early November. Coleridge wrote a letter to his friend John Kenyon in which he added a postscript. My address after Tuesday will be, God permitting, Mr. Page's surgeon, Calne. And there you can see from this map, this 1828 map, Coleridge's house with the courtyard at the back, George Page's house there with the more space at the back, stables at the back, and opposite St Mary's Church, with a tower built on the north transept, because the spire collapsed in 1638. Also opposite Coleridge's house, to the side of the church, north of the church, was the Guildhall. It stopped being a Guildhall in 1829, but when Coleridge was living in Calne, this was the centre of local government. The town crier would shout out or proclaim what was going on, the news, rules and regulations, etc., at proclamation steps. They're very literally a stone's throw from where Coleridge was living. And there's the tower that you can see today. Quite unique, as it's a perpendicular survival tower. It looks much older, but it's actually 17th century to replace the spire. And he loved the countryside. He was struck by the White Horse at Charrel, which had been cut there on the down some 30 years previously by Dr. Christopher Alsop, the mad doctor, as he came to be known. There wasn't nothing mad about him, but because he directed operations through a speaking trumpet, people thought he was a bit of an eccentric. Interestingly, Alsop didn't die until 1816 at the age of 84. So it's certain, almost certain, that Coleridge would have known him. He would have known the man who had that horse cut. Calne was connected to the canal network. Here we have a branch of the Wiltshire and Berkshire Canal connecting Calne with the canal network, which meant Somerset coal, Bath stone could easily come in. That spot today that you can see there now looks like this. Very different, of course. You can no longer see the church tower because of the trees. The canal lies derelict. The wharf is still there. You can see the water would have been much higher to allow the barges to unload their coal and stone and other goods directed by the wharfinger who lived in this house, now Martin House. The walk along the river, Coleridge would have enjoyed, and on to Bowood to see his friend the Marquis of Lansdowne, and the 2 miles to Bremhill, where he often borrowed a horse from William Lyle Bowles. Bowles had some fantastic gardens: bower, grotto, cascade, hermitage, urns, seats, inscriptions. Sadly, he had one inscription commemorating the end of the war in 1814. Fecit anno 1814, the year of peace. Unfortunately, of course, it was to kick off again the following year, but Bowles didn't know that. Lansdowne thought Bowles's garden was one of the prettiest spots in Wiltshire. Coleridge described it as a sweet paradise of a place. Coleridge went to Devizes often to see Brabant, to see Dr. Brabant and his family, exchanging letters with him on German philosophy, metaphysics, politics, tobacco, snuff. He loved his snuff. It wasn't just laudanum and alcohol he liked tobacco too. If you go to Devizes today, Snuff Street reminds us where Anstey's tobacco factory used to be. And as I said, they used the windmills to grind the tobacco, to pulverize it, to make snuff. Coleridge loved it. So Coleridge has settled in really well. He clearly was enjoying Calne. Living opposite the church may well have reminded him of his childhood in Ottery St Mary, where John Coleridge had been the vicar. The proximity of the Bentley Free School may also have reminded him of his father's role as head at the King's Grammar School in Ottery. His father's former scholastic position he may have been reminded of here. In fact, if you think about it, here, this classroom overlooks Church Street to this day. It hasn't been a classroom for many, many years. The boys' entrance look has been bricked up. But that spot is only a stone's throw, as you can see from this picture, from Coleridge's house. And the church tower, you can see to the right of the photograph. So church and school, very much part of his vista. The tree was where the town hall used to be before it was demolished in 1882. This was where the marketplace was that Coleridge would have known extremely well. He'd have recognised this place, without the cars, of course, the tarmac. The brewery at the back of the Catherine Wheel Inn reflected the liveliness of this market town. The buildings are still there. A later photograph shows the Lansdowne Brewery still in use. He didn't like the beer. The ale here from public houses is either syrup or vinegar. But the carriageway, this arch here into what is now the Lansdowne Strand Hotel, was the Catherine Wheel coaching inn. The carriageway in which carriages could come into the yard at the back is still there. The mill pond is where this white car is on the right there. And the map shows all this. There's the carriageway coming straight in. There's the brewery buildings. It's in 1828 map. The town mill was demolished to be replaced by a Victorian town hall later on. The wharf is still very much in evidence. That's the 1886 town hall that was built later. Even better, when Coleridge came out of his house over the little wooden bridge over the River Marden, if he didn't want to go into the Wheel, he could turn right and go into Thomas Bishop's druggist, where he got his laudanum. So there you are. It was all on the doorstep for him. That's where Thomas Bishop's druggist was. You wouldn't believe it now, would you? Completely out of sight by the modern development you see today. There's the Guildhall opposite Coleridge's house. There's the proclamation steps when news and events were read out by the town crier to the local people. That's what the town hall was, what it used to look like. This is a photograph taken before it's demolished in 1882. I simply superimposed it on a modern photograph that I took, so you get the idea. The mill has been replaced by a later town hall down the bottom there. So politics was in his face, which it had to be, because at the end of the war, Britain was being flooded by foreign imports. We could now trade with Europe again. So French corn, French wheat came in, threatening to cause the price of bread to plummet, which is good for working people, but not so good for the landowners. They wanted to keep the price of bread high. So they brought in a bill into Parliament, the Corn Bill, to make it illegal to bring in any wheat until the price rose to 80 shillings a quarter. The curse of the Corn Bill, as this poster tells you, it was. Good for the landowners, not so good for the working people. If the poor can't buy, they must starve. As this gentleman on the right, I'm going to leave my native country where the poor are crushed by those they labour to support. The next few years were to bring Britain closer to revolution, as close as it had been since the 17th century. But that's another story. I won't digress on that one. What I will say is that Coleridge took the side of the working people, of the labouring classes. He stood up in the marketplace and he galvanised the people of Calne to get a petition together to oppose this Corn Bill. A public meeting. You cannot conceive how this Corn Bill haunts me, and so it would you if you'd seen the pale faces and heard the conversation of the 100 poor creatures who came to sign the petition. Few of them seem to have had more than an occasional acquaintance with butcher's meat. He made this speech on a butcher's table, making a butcherly sort of speech, but he made that point, that it may be a place where pigs were slaughtered, but not much meat was consumed by the labouring classes. They couldn't afford it. The price of bread was absolute. This was reported in the national press, the Morning Post. A spirited and firm and temperate petition to Parliament was agreed to against the Corn Bill. Mr. Coleridge, a celebrated poet, addressed the meeting in favour of the petition in a speech replete with argument, with persuasive eloquence. The words "No Corn Bill" are now conspicuously chalked up the walls in various parts of the town. This is the earliest form of political graffiti I've ever found in England. They had no spray paints then, but they had chalk and they used it. No Corn Bill. But sadly, they failed to kill the bill. The Corn Law was passed on 10th of March 1815. Over the other side of the Channel, Napoleon had escaped from Elba. Was greeted as a hero in Paris. The 100 days had begun in earnest that was to end on the field at Waterloo. Coleridge needed money. Getting involved in politics was great, but it didn't make him any money. He needed to make money somehow. So he wrote to his old publisher, Joseph Cottle, suggesting that he get together all his poems, complete them, revise them, all those in scattered publications, those still in manuscript. And would you give me an advance of £40 for all that, please, Mr. Cottle? Would you please do that? Joseph Cottle thought long and hard about it. Well, he didn't think that long, actually, because he felt this was not a good idea. This was a bad horse to bet on. Coleridge was not in a place where he's going to be able to write, so Cottle thought, anything particularly profound. And he suggested to Coleridge that he just cut back his expenses. And Coleridge replied, well, I've paid my expenses to the bone. I'm having to survive on £2, 10 shillings a week. When you think the agricultural labourers of the time were on 7 shillings a week, 1/7 of that, it does rather put it into perspective. You can only guess where Coleridge was spending his money. So Cottle said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Perhaps you could write new poems. And even that didn't work. Because Coleridge basically said, I can't do this. I'm not in the position to do this. The very necessity of being creative means I can't be creative. I can't sing with my breast against a thorn. So the correspondence was cut off. And Cottle didn't help him. Coleridge was getting desperate. Perhaps he could start a day school for 15 scholars or 20 pupils at £15 a year each, or perhaps a treatise on the Corn Law. He worked as a journalist before, so maybe, but none of these things happened. So he tried a new tack. The German philosophy he was reading gave him an idea. Perhaps if I could get all my opinions and literary thoughts together in one volume, it'd be a massive volume, but perhaps now is the time to write my magnum opus. Perhaps it will help me get over this breakdown, to actually put in perspective my thoughts on life, poetry, literature, philosophy, religion. Perhaps it's a good thing for me to do. So he wrote to Matthew Gutch and William Hood, the proprietors of Felix Farley's Bristol Journal. He'd written articles on art and had them published. Perhaps they would help him. Perhaps they would support him in this bold new venture. They agreed. £45 towards the work, 250 to 300 pages to be ready by mid-June. Quite an order. Byron was approached. His friend, Lord George Byron, would you give me some help to write my Biographia Literaria, this synthesis of my interpretation of literature, in particular poetry and philosophy, my presentation of my life and opinions. Would you do that? Byron had just got married. He was at the zenith of his career. His Corsair and Hebrew melodies were selling well, 10,000 copies in the first week. Good terms with his publisher, Murray. Byron magnanimously agreed that it'd be a great pleasure to help my friend in writing this work. Remembering that Remorse had been a great event, a great success for him, perhaps he could do the same again. The epigraph at the beginning of his book was taken from Goethe, the German equivalent of Shakespeare, the great German writer of the time, of all time. And in his epigraph, Goethe says a lot about friendship and how important it is to keep friends and to renew friends and to make new friends. But at the end of this epigraph, he comes up with this strange phrase. He wishes to spare the young those circuitous paths on which he himself had lost his way. Is this perhaps Coleridge thinking, I don't want people to make the mistakes I did. I don't want people to think about taking laudanum, this horrible thing that I have, it's afflicted me in this terrible way. Perhaps in a way the biography was an advice to young men, in as much as it was a work of literature, biography, literary biography. Then crisis. An infected traveller, believed to be suffering from smallpox, from Newbury, from the stagecoach from Newbury, was forced off the stagecoach in Calne and made to self-isolate in a cow shed. In those days, there was a vaccine, and the vaccine was quite literally injecting people with cowpox, which was not a serious illness. It was mild, it wasn't going to kill you, but it would make you immune from smallpox. They knew that. The Latin for cow, vacca, of course, is where vaccine comes from. So being vaccinated is literally having a cow put into you. So this rather unkind cartoon shows cows growing out of people's limbs and parts of their bodies. Whether this is a kind of anti-vaxxer poster or whether it's taken the mickey out of anti-vaxxers, I don't know. But Charlotte Brent had come into contact with the infected traveller. Coleridge was alarmed, to say the least. He didn't want anything to happen to his dear Charlotte. There was no vaccine in Calne, so he rode over to Devizes to get some from Dr. Brabant. And Charlotte was injected, she was inoculated, and she did not catch smallpox. So quite a story, really, perhaps quite relevant with what's going on in the world today. We know all this because at the end of a letter he wrote to William Wordsworth, his erstwhile friend and rival, he tells us this story that the smallpox having appeared in Calne and Mrs. Morgan's sister, believing herself never to have had it, he took this action. And he's going to answer the letter to Wordsworth. This is the time when Wordsworth and Coleridge, they've been very, very close, lifelong friends, but they were falling out. Coleridge wanted to make do the friendship. He wanted to renew that friendship. So he invited Wordsworth over to Calne. Perhaps we could have a look at the paintings at Corsham. Perhaps we could have a look at Bowles's garden. Wouldn't it be nice? Mr. and Mrs. Morgan would love you to come and stay. Why don't you come and stay, William? Sadly, he didn't. Perhaps he knew that their friendship perhaps was strained. Coleridge was concerned about Wordsworth's self-obsession, his obsession for his professional work, the force of self-vorticity, as he called it. Wordsworth was a driven man, and I don't think Coleridge was very happy about that. So he gets on with this work in 4 or 5 hour stints every day throughout June and July. He gets on with his Biographia. He dictates to John Morgan, who acts as his amanuensis, taking the notes that he needs to take. And the work progresses rapidly. He rarely leaves the house in Church Street, except to walk in the meadows or to discover a group of itinerant players who are acting in the theatre at the top of the town. Mr. Faulkner, their producer, suggests, why don't we perform Remorse? Mr. Coleridge is living here, why don't we make him a provincial celebrity? Coleridge was a bit lukewarm, but when after the play was produced, he was amazed. They appeared to me to act just as well as those on the London stage, indeed far beyond my expectation. There you are, that's praise indeed for Mr. Faulkner and his itinerant stage players. Coleridge's son, Hartley, chose to stay the summer with his father in Calne. He just finished his first term at Oxford. The first time in his life, at the age of 18, he had a free choice. Are you going to stay with mum, brother and sister in the Lakes, or are you going to stay with dad in Calne? Hartley decided to stay with dad, and the Morgans supported this. They thought it'd be great for that household to have young Hartley around, would reinvigorate, would create a better relationship between son and father, a new kind of family unity into the household. It would be great. Perhaps father could help Hartley with his undergraduate studies. Hartley would be impressed by seeing his father hard at work, not an image perhaps he was used to. Uncle Robert, though, wasn't so keen. Robert Southey, who'd married Coleridge's estranged wife's sister, Edith Fricker, great benefactor to the family, poet laureate, he believed that if Hartley went to stay, his greatest danger arises from his father. He would go off course if he spent too much time with his dad. That was what Robert Southey thought. He was wrong, fortunately. Hartley decides to stay in direct opposition to Uncle Robert's wishes. And he gets on very well with the Morgans. John Morgan, he discovers he has shared interest in theatre. Mary Morgan found him extremely amiable. He stayed till October, that long summer holiday from Oxford. Years later, he wrote a nostalgic essay on Calne, a place I can never think of without a strong twitching of the eye, recalling the jumbled and irregular houses, the chalky hills and streams, and some wildish half-common fields with old remains of hawthorn bower and clumps of shady trees, where I used to dream my mornings away, right pleasantly. He became very much part of the household and joined in the celebrations to commemorate Wellington's victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. And as I say, Hartley got on well with John Morgan. They helped with the production of Remorse by helping with the scenery behind the scenes, and they helped with the music. Remorse relied on music for its dramatic effects. And he loved the Morgans. He thought they were good, comfortable, unintellectual people in whose company I always thought STC, Dad, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, more than usually pleasant. And they were for a time strolling players for whom, and indeed for all itinerants, I have a great liking. He thought the Morgans were far more easygoing than the snuffy Wordsworths. That's the impression you get from these comments that he made. He looked back on this holiday as one of the happiest of his life. And Mary Morgan writes to the Lambs. Charles Lamb was a school friend of Coleridge at Christ's Hospital. And he writes to the Lambs saying, Coleridge is really getting on with this. Morgan's already taken notes. He's written nearly 200 pages. And we're going to add a collection of poems, the Sibylline Leaves. And Coleridge is working on a collection of poems as well. This is incredible. Even Wordsworth gets a good mention. I think Coleridge had some kind of regret. He had pangs of the fading of his friendship with his erstwhile friend and rival. That Wordsworth he accepted. In imaginative power, he stands nearest of all modern writers to Shakespeare and Milton. He accepted that for imagination, Wordsworth was second to none. So they'd finished the book, so he thought. He took his son to dine with the Marquis of Lansdowne at Beauwood House. And that should have been the end of the story, except that Coleridge began to have second thoughts. He thought perhaps a second volume would be in order, that he hadn't really come to grips with philosophy. And he felt he ought to do this, really, because that was the whole point of starting it in the first place. Constructive, dynamic, idealistic German philosophy, that was what he was into. He wanted to analyse all this, how he'd changed, how he'd shifted from the materialist English philosophers like David Hartley. He'd named his son after him, after all, and John Locke. How he'd moved, how he'd shifted from those kinds of materialist empiricist views to more idealistic ones, which we were talking about earlier. Immanuel Kant, the essential change from a reductive concept of the human mind as a mirror of canvas, a tabula rasa, passively registering physical existence. That is the human mind simply a product of what you've experienced, or is there anything more? Is there a spiritual dimension? Is something mysterious and intuitive? Are there faculties here that are beyond that kind of dry materialist background? And Coleridge thought there were. So this conversion from a philosophic, materialist to religious view of the world is there in the Biographia. It's difficult reading, but it's well worth the effort. So he finished, or I think frankly, escaped from the Biographia by the end of September. And he'd finished his collection of Sibylline Leaves. This was looking good for Coleridge in Calne. The manuscripts are sent off to Gutch in Bristol. Looked, when they're published, perhaps some money would be coming his way. And he'd actually proved the doctors wrong, that he was able to get over this breakdown. He was able to pull the rabbit out of the hat and to come up with these amazing pieces of work, proving his life was not quite worthless. He'd achieved that fantastic result. So he invited Gutch over to Calne, promising to row him about the lake at Bowood and conduct him around the paintings at Corsham while they discussed publication details. And not forgetting Hartley, Coleridge managed to persuade Gutch to advance him £10, which he gave to his son to go back to Oxford with. And Hartley, no doubt, very happy young man, went back to Oxford after spending this wonderful summer with his father in October 1815. So, printing of Sibylline Leaves and the Biographia is expected to happen very quickly, but unfortunately, the rush that Coleridge had produced this meant there were lots and lots of errors, and the printers, bless them, they weren't used to demanding texts with the Latin, Greek glosses, epigraphs, poetry, footnotes. It was not an easy work to print, not an easy work to publish. 15 proofs, a total of 15 proofs, were winging their way from Bristol to Calne through the end of 1815 and into the early months of 1816, as late as February. And Coleridge had to proofwrite and improve and correct these proofs. And sadly, the strain of all this sent him off the rails. He started knocking back the laudanum again, started drinking again, and he wasn't a well man. On his 43rd birthday, on October the 21st, Trafalgar Day, 1815, he commented, "In all but the brain, I am an old man." He feared for his life, and he was running out of drugs. Secret notes were sent to chemists and druggists in Calne and Devizes. "Mr. Coleridge requests there be sent by the bearer 3 ounces of laudanum, or whatever quantity this bottle may hold. Half an ounce of crude opium, if there be none purified. 2 ounces of the tincture of cardamom." There are stormy scenes, embarrassing moments at the houses of friends in Calne. In December, he stayed with the Reverend William Money. He'd been corresponding. His faith, his renewed Christianity, he'd been corresponding with the Reverend Money about the doctrine of salvation. There's a letter that survived. It's well worth reading. And he stayed with the Reverend Money. But in the morning, after he'd left, the Reverend Money discovered a pile of empty brandy bottles in his bedroom. But Coleridge later explained to Dr. Brabham that these were really bottles of medicine that he'd sent a servant to collect from the Calne druggist that inadvertently left behind after his visit. There was no brandy on them, merely tinctures of rhubarb, cardamom and laudanum, with a half-pint flat bottle of British gin. There's no reason why, I can't understand why the Reverend Money should be shocked. And incredibly, despite all this chaos in his life, he finds the time during the Christmas of 1815 and into January 1816 to write a verse play, a play in verse, inspired by Shakespeare's Christmas tale called Sapolia. A lightweight piece perhaps, but to have written this in the wake of all that's happened is quite remarkable. It was to be his last play. It was later rejected by Drury Lane, but it was performed later on in 1816 by Thomas Dibdin at the Surrey Theatre, Blackfriars Road in London. Wasn't received well, but it was applauded for its high-toned and picturesque beauty. A sunny shaft did I behold, from sky to earth it slanted, and poised therein a bird so bold, sweet bird, thou wert enchanted. Quite poignant work in so many ways. So it looked as if this would help, but it didn't. It didn't really lift Coleridge from his post-Biographia relapse, and there were tensions within the Morgan household. John Morgan was getting depressed now because the proofs weren't being adequately corrected. There were still too many hold-ups, and John Morgan was getting impatient. Success was slipping through their fingers. Come on, Coleridge, get your finger out, get it sorted. But Coleridge would just simply disappear into his bedroom, leaving little notes. Tomorrow morning, I doubt not, I shall be of clear and collected spirits. But tonight I feel I shall do nothing to any purpose. I'll be all right, just give me tomorrow, I'll do it then. Give me a break. This is incredible, because on the back of one of this missives, Morgan jotted the opening stanza from the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, a poem that if anybody knows anything at all about Coleridge, they will know about the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It was one of his early poems, but it was in Calne that he completed the marginal glosses on it. He prepared the Mariner for publication whilst he was living in Calne. He decided to give it first place on the front of Sibylline Leaves, his collection of poetry. And he wrote, on the back of one of these missives, Morgan wrote, "There is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three. By thy grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me?" So quite relevant, really, isn't it, to have this great work involved in Coleridge's stay in Calne. But he knew that he could not risk another relapse. If he didn't get out of Calne in the spring of 1816, he felt he might never live to see another one. He recognised he needed to be living with a doctor for the rest of his life. He wasn't going to get that in Calne. Opium was barely back under his control. He confided to Dr. Prabant he was trying not to exceed the smallest dose of poison that would suffice to keep me tranquil and capable of literary labour. He went on pretty well, but he knew one more relapse might finish him. But none of the works in hand, Sapolia, the Biographia, the Sibylline Leaves, had been published yet. There was no money coming in. He wrote to Gutcher in desperation, the proprietor of the Felix Farley Bristol Journal, in desperation of his the dead water of his finances. How can I get out? How can I go back to London? How can I finance this? Which of my old friends would help me? Who's not yet given me up for lost? And this is where, incredibly, Coleridge seems to have friends that almost come out of the woodwork. When you least expect it, they come out, they help him. William Sotheby, perhaps not the most well-known of Coleridge's friends, he applied to the Literary Fund, an institution of anonymous philanthropists whose statutes allowed them to help men of genius in poverty and distress. He put Coleridge's case to them, and he also wrote to Lord Byron, without telling Coleridge he was doing it. On the 14th of February 1816, on St. Valentine's Day, the fund, having noted the case of Mr. Coleridge, author of various poems and dramatic works of merit, was taken into consideration, resolved £30 be voted to the above applicant. The very same day, Lord Byron sent a £100 banknote to Church Street in Calne. Coleridge was found by breathless Charlotte. "You've had a letter franked by Lord Byron." She found him completely lost, thinking of the thing itself and the manner in which it was done. He'd had to be bailed out again by his friends. Clearly, he was deeply embarrassed by this. Nevertheless, it was his ticket home. The cherry white horse must have been seen on the ground, on the side of the downs there, galloping towards London, pointing the way for the last 16 months that Coleridge had been living in Calne. Within little more than a month, he was on his way, no doubt waving at the white horse and Cheryl Down. He left the Morgans to tidy up the chaos of loose manuscripts in his study. On the 15th of April, 1816, Coleridge moved into Morton House, Highgate, to live with the physician, Dr. James Gilman, and Gilman's wife, Anne, who accepted him as a house patient. He was to spend the rest of his life in Highgate, trying to cure, or at least to treat, his opium addiction. He died at the age of 61 on the 25th of July, 1834, some 18 years later. His works, the Biographia, Sibylline Leaves and Sepolia, all written in Calne, were published the following year, the year after he arrived in Highgate in 1817. The time he spent in Calne was highly productive, both in terms of his work and the quality time he spent with his son Hartley in the summer of 1815. He had admitted that his poetic powers have been for some years in a state of suspended animation. Remember, he couldn't produce new poems for Cottle, for Joseph Cottle. In the end, he had to write the Biographia because that was the only kind of work he could actually achieve. Yet his friend, the Irish bard, Thomas Moore, described Coleridge like a giant refreshed with sleep after his stay in Wiltshire. In fact, Moore himself in 1817 moved into Slopperton Cottage in Bromham, not far from Calne, south of Chippenham. So there's a Wiltshire connection there. Today, if you look around Calne, you try to tread in the steps and the footsteps of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you'll see the church, you'll see his house, you'll see the Canal Wharf, you'll see the Lansdowne Strand Hotel, the old Catherine Wheel. But much of that part of Calne was decimated by the Harris's factories. That's why there is all this modern development. This is where they were, here and here. Church Street and High Street factories demolished in the 1880s, and even a black hole that's been redeveloped over the last 35 to 40 years. The 1968 Relief Road did huge damage, but you can still tread in the footsteps of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Ashley, Calne, Colsham House, Bremill, Devizes, Bowood. Of course, he went through Marlborough on his way to the West Country, no doubt on the way back to London. So there are quite a few places in Wiltshire that he had obvious attraction to. So thank you for listening. Appreciate your efforts and your time, your interest. If you have any questions, I will try my best to answer them. So thank you. Stop share, I think. Should we?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Nick. That's great. My colleague Rachel is going to ask you a few questions. So I'm going to make sure you jump back in the hot seat, and then Rachel will commandeer.
So if anyone in the audience has any questions for Nick, if you just pop them into the chat box, and then I will read them out to Nick. So perhaps to start us off, Nick, you could just, what do you think the relationship was? Was Coleridge having an affair with his friend's wife?
Well, I used to know Ken Watts, very eminent local historian. I mean, I am just a novice compared to Ken, bless him. He's written loads of books about Wiltshire, and sadly Ken passed away last year. It's a great shock to me in his 80s. But he thought he was having an affair, yes. We discussed this at length. Ken visited Ashley too. And he certainly believed that there was something going on between Charlotte and Sam, without a doubt. But on the other hand, there's no proof of that, is there? And but you know, you have to wonder, don't you? So I think in the end, you just have to leave it to what you think might have happened. It's not, you know, we don't know. So we have to give them the benefit of the doubt, don't we? Really. But he did have, I mean, he had many infatuations at school. The sister of one of his friends, forget her name now, he was infatuated with. There was Azra, Sarah Hutchinson, who I think was something to do with Wordsworth, that he had a long-standing affair with. So you had to feel sorry for his wife, Sarah Fricker, really. You know, he clearly was a ladies' man, but whether he actually had an affair with Charlotte, I couldn't be sure. The jury is out on that, I'm afraid.
So we've just had thank you. We've just had another question come through here from Penny Lay, who asks, what was John Morgan's business?
Well, I was hoping you weren't going to ask that. There was all sorts of things. They had various shops in London. His wife, Mary Morgan, I think it was a cheese shop. I'd have to check that. But I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that, because I'm not quite sure. He seems to have had his fingers in all sorts of pies. He was a merchant, basically. He ran shops. I think he may have had property, but of course, again, the fact he was obviously running shops, I suppose. Why they failed, I couldn't say for sure. I mean, all I will say is that 1813 wasn't a good year for anybody. You know, the Napoleonic War was at its height. You couldn't trade. The continental system was, strangling Britain, to be honest. Napoleon was trying to cut Britain off. You know, not too dissimilar to what Hitler tried to do during the war, and of course the Germans in the First World War trying to isolate Britain. So it must have been hard in whatever business you were in while that war was going on. So I'm sorry to have to say I'm not certain what his business was. I think I need to do a little bit more research on that. But there were fingers in many pies. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do.
What brought them down to Wiltshire originally? Work or? Do we have any more questions for anyone?
Yeah. That's great. Well, that just leaves me to thank Nick very much. And we very much look forward to welcoming him and to welcoming you to this year's summer school, which we hope will go ahead as normally as possible. So I bid you all a very good night. Thank you very much.